we invite you for the breakout session. Make deals, break deals, or fake deals. A view from the United Nations Security Council. Will the crises of global institutions lead to more armed conflicts? Do we need more peace operations? How can conflict prevention thrive in today's global environment?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second day afternoon sessions of the Warsaw Security Forum. It is my great privilege, it is my great honor, and I'm extremely happy to announce that we have a wonderful group of panelists who are going to share some of the insights they have on very important global topics. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Mr. Prime Minister Eamon Gilmore, former Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland and Foreign Minister of Ireland, currently Special Envoy to the Colombia peace process. Please, Mr. Minister. I welcome Ambassador Bogusław Winit, currently one of the advisors to the President of Poland, former ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to NATO, and Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland. Welcome, Ambassador. I would like to invite Ms. Julianne Smith, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden. Correct? Yes, thank you very much. Please join us at the panel. We're also very, very happy to be joined by colleagues from the UK, and the UK is represented today by Ms. Corinne Kitzel, who is the UN coordinator at the Foreign Office in London. Please join us. Thank you for coming. And last but absolutely not least, I'm very happy to welcome from our neighboring side, from Germany, Ms. Almut Wieland-Karimi, who is the Director for the Center for Peace Operations.
Fabulous. We've had the rounds of hellos. Ladies and gentlemen, well, this is probably, you know, maybe the dove panel of the hawkish forum, but I think it's extremely important that we bring up some of the topics we want to raise here, because the multilateral system that we as organizers here of the forum believe is an extremely important bedrock of the international security architecture seems to be shaken with the developments of recent years. We are meeting today here also because we believe that the issues of conflict resolution, conflict prevention, of global peace operations require sustained and continued global attention, and that the community from the region of Central and Eastern Europe, from Poland, of course, and more broadly from the EU and globally, needs to pay special attention to the developments in those areas in those turbulent times. Hence, also a little bit of a provocative title for our session, Make Deals, Break Deals, or Fake Deals. Of course, as you know, Poland is currently taking a non-permanent seat at the Security Council, so we'd like to see this as a bit of a Security Council worldview here. I would like to start our discussions with a bit of a perhaps positive outlook. This is sort of a reflection from the last day and a half that we need to try to see where are the building blocks that we can, in this changing international landscape, see some progress in the spheres of crisis and conflict globally. And if I may turn to Prime Minister Gilmore to open up and give us a bit of a introduction, perhaps some glimmers of hope.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity of being here for the past day, but I've got some reports that you had a good look at the apocalypse over the past 24 hours or so. I've been working for the past 3 years on the Colombian peace process as the European Union envoy. And I think what is interesting about that is a couple of things. First of all, this was one of the longest and bloodiest guerrilla conflicts in the world, claimed the lives of about 250,000 people, about 6 million people displaced. And 2 years ago, the Colombian government and the largest guerrilla movement concluded a peace agreement. It had difficulties. It was defeated in a plebiscite. It was renegotiated. This group disarmed last year. We had a general election in the country since then, a presidential election, which elected a new president who had originally been an opponent of the agreement, but who is now working to implement it, and indeed who was in Brussels yesterday. I was there with him, meeting with President Tusk and Juncker and Federica Mogherini and EU leaders, talking about the implementation of the agreement. So it's moved on, and of course the UN has also played a critical role in its implementation. This is an issue on which the Security Council has been agreed. We are now into a second UN mission. There's been a lot of innovative work done to implement disarmament and different aspects of the agreement. And it's also an issue on which the European Union and the United States have been working in very close cooperation, and that cooperation is continuing. I did have a US counterpart at one stage, but he wasn't reappointed by the new administration. Nevertheless, the cooperation has continued through the US Embassy in Bogota and through EU State Department cooperation.
Oh, thanks very much. So I think this is a good good beacon, perhaps. But the other outlooks from the Security Council have not been that good. Perhaps I would turn to Ambassador Vinit on the other side to give us a little bit of a taste, sort of what's the look on key crises from the side of the Security Council, and what are the perspectives of some progress in such areas, for instance, as getting agreements on peace operations reform?
Thank you very much. Well, Security Council creates a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges. And so the picture is very much mixed. We have areas with successes where UN was able to prevent conflict or to find a solution, but also in other areas there was a failure. Well, one of the reasons is, of course, the veto power. And veto power is an extremely interesting question, and we can spend the next panel discussing how to reform the veto power, or can we reform it, or how to do it. But UN is very much involved in peacekeeping missions. This is one of the core operations of the UN, and political mission like in Colombia. What is also important is cooperation between UN and the regional organization and UN and EU. And we have special agreement which was just signed in New York, how UN will cooperate with the EU. If I can just give you 1 minute statistics about the peacekeeping operation and what's the role of the UN. Basically, right now we have 110,000 peacekeepers all over the world. Soldiers, police officers, correction officers, civilians. So this is huge group of men and women serving in 14 missions. So the total budget, when we look at the budget, is $6.7 billion US. One of the points is that this budget is actually too small, too low to have decisive impact.
That's lightly put.
Yes, well, if I can give you just maybe 2 more figures, US is paying 28% of those, the Russia 4%. Poland less than 1%. Okay, but the cost per one soldier, the reimbursement from the UN is $1,428 per soldier per month. So for some countries, this is, well, everybody's complaining, but some countries subsidize peacekeeping operations more, some countries less. So when we will discuss the further how to reform the system or what can be done better, what can we do better, this discrepancy between who is providing finance and who is sending troops is one of the key questions we should discuss.
Oh, thank you very much. Since we're on the topic of reform, Almut, if I may ask you, the last 2.5 years have seen actually quite a lot done, I believe, in terms of how to reform and how to move forward with the reform of all peacekeeping operations, to actually link the political and the military component into one consolidated peace operation, and it's been high on, I think, the Secretary General agenda. But in today's international environment, where does this reform stand? What are the prospects for more effective and better peace operations?
Well, thank you, and thank you very much also to mentioning the core problems, as I could see that are being dealt with in New York or at UN headquarters. Well, I think the most challenging question really is to do prevention. I mean, everybody talks about conflict prevention, and for sure it's a question about political economy. Every child would understand that it's better to prevent a war or conflict, and it would save a lot of lives, it would save a lot of money. You would have to send less troops, less police, less civilian experts. However, the world or politics don't really work that way. I mean, once there is breaking news on whatever issue, let's have a look at Saudi Arabia lately. I mean, there's a war in Yemen, 10,000s of deaths. There's been there's a death penalty in Saudi Arabia. There are other issues. And many people knew, but it's a partner country for various reasons. And then, very unfortunately, a journalist that many of us knew got killed in a terrible and a terrific way. And all of a sudden there is this wake-up call that it can't go on like this. So the prevention really issue is very important. And the mechanism is that we don't not only follow the breaking news, but we understand what's really happening in conflict countries, which really requires a very solid conflict analysis, and which requires to understand that the situation in Mali is different from the situation in Ukraine, which was discussed on an earlier panel, is different from a situation in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So we have certain instruments, you have mentioned some, but there's no blueprint how to deal with peace operations. And what's happening with all these reports, which I think are very important, is that there is a much better understanding now how to deal with the variety of conflicts and to make sure that we not always use the same instrument, but that there is a variety of instruments at our disposal. And we have just learned about Colombia. And I mean, mediation really played a crucial role in Colombia. And of course, the concerted effort by important powers in that country. So, from my perspective, the glass is it's kind of half full, because the awareness has risen that this business is much more complicated than people used to think, and that there is really many who commit to kind of to understand that the complexity is much higher, and to kind of really work on how in a multilateral operations how we can cooperate much better.
No, thank you very much for that. And of course, integrating conflict prevention into the overall peace operation and seeing how it could be effective, a critical, very important issue. The way that you described this is how it could be effective. It seems that the policy messages we're hearing from Washington are the opposite. And if I may ask Julianne to give us some comments on what is really the current thinking in Washington in terms of the multilateral approach, particularly, I mean, the recent change also with Nikki Haley now gone. Perhaps you can give us a glimpse who'll be the next ambassador, but you know, the shadow of John Bolton. I was in New York at the time when he was in his post. I remember that time vividly. So are we in for a more John Bolton approach to these multilateral initiatives?
Well, I mean, it's hard to predict what the U.S. position vis-a-vis the UN will be going forward, because it hinges a lot on the person that they actually go with, and there's all sorts of names being circulated. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think Nikki Haley did and continues to reflect the administration's core instincts on multilateral institutions, and that is that their belief that the U.S. is somehow still getting a raw deal, that it's doing too much. It often comes back to the theme of burden sharing. You've heard them talking a lot about U.S. contributions to the UN. They've removed themselves from some corners of the institution, particularly vis-a-vis human rights, but they're not even spending the funds that have been appropriated by Congress. So there seems to be throughout the administration this fundamental lack of trust and belief in multilateral institutions like the United Nations. Haley, at times, when pushed, will defend the institution, but has also carried out a number of instructions, no doubt, coming from her boss and John Bolton, who clearly has his own personal experience with that institution that we all know quite well. So it's disheartening because obviously even, you know, the Secretary General himself, no one's prepared to stand up and say this is a perfect institution. Certainly plenty of folks will admit that it needs work, and there have been issues all along the lines of some of the administration's critique, but to fundamentally give up on the organization and walk away from it, or to undermine the institution by either belittling or reducing U.S. commitments and enthusiasm for the United Nations or other institutions is, in my mind, not the best way to go about it. So I just, it's hard to predict the future. I think as long as John Bolton, though, remains National Security Advisor, we will continue to feel his influence on this question going forward. I don't see a major change there, irrespective of who comes in to replace Nikki Haley. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, they're an equal opportunity disliker of multilateral institutions. This isn't just specifically directed at the UN. Obviously, they've had plenty of things to say about the ICC, which is another area where John Bolton has had a number of critiques, but NATO and plenty of other institutions have taken a beating by this administration.
Speaking of the U.S. Engagements, I recall that there was this one of the last, I believe, summits that President Obama chaired in the UN was on peace operations and on reform, with a big message of support, and that was just for a couple of months. Then it got cut. But Corinne, I think there was you were picking up on those UN summits in London with a summit on peace operations and wars. Where do you see this? The whole, you know, agenda moving forward in terms of getting global consensus on strengthening peace operations, on reforming, and generally the role that they should play in conflicts?
Well, we hosted the London Peacekeeping Defence Ministerial. That was in the autumn of 2016, and I think at that point all of the participants agreed to a framework for reforming peace operations that at that point was framed around 3 Ps, which was planning, pledges, and performance. The pledges part of that was building on what had been started previously by President Obama, which was basically about the UN essentially sort of strengthening its bench. Up to that point, the the number of TCCs, the number and variety of troops and key enablers and capabilities that were available to the UN were actually quite limited. So there have been real concrete efforts since then to bring in new TCCs, to bring in new capabilities, and that is now starting to bear some fruit. The planning part of those 3 Ps was around how you plan the kind of whole life cycle of missions. So the idea that they should have a clearer startup phase, clearer objectives, and actually have an exit strategy. And while we're sort of mentioning, you know, examples of success, that in the last couple of years we've seen the peacekeeping operations in Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire draw to a conclusion and transition to UN country teams. So those can be regarded as peace operations that were actually successful. And then the third of those 3 Ps around performance, I mean, that's been a really big issue in the UN over the last couple of years. Probably the issue that's had the most publicity has been around sexual exploitation and abuse by those employed in peace operations, whether military or police or civilian. There's still a long way to go on that, and I think many more cases are going to come to light, but the UN has taken great strides in that respect. I mean, from a UK perspective, it's been really encouraging to see new TCs come online. The UK has expanded its contribution to peacekeeping, and we're in the process at the moment of transitioning a field hospital that we've been running in South Sudan to the Vietnamese, for example, and that's their first experience of UN peacekeeping. But I think there's also a sort of some broader points here that peacekeeping is just one part of a whole spectrum of activities. And the Secretary General's concept of sustaining peace, where we view peacekeeping as one example in a toolbox of different options that are available to member states, I think is a real transformational shift in the UN, that instead of thinking of things in very strict silos, we're thinking much more about a transition. And I think also in terms of sort of conflict prevention, we've reached a point where there are more tools available, early warning systems, more conflict-sensitive development, things that have happened in recent years that are making a difference. I also think that another major change has been the development of sort of the NGO sector in the kind of mediation, so that it's not all about state actors, that it's not all about states solving peace processes, that you've now got NGOs and civil society organizations who are operating under the radar, who can speak to groups and parties to conflicts who, frankly, it's difficult for governments to speak to. So there's lots of very positive developments over recent years. Not to paint an overly rosy picture, but I think that sometimes the narrative around the dysfunctionality of the Security Council because Syria gets all the headlines sort of belies the fact that actually lots of positive progress has been made, but also that very many missions and mandates and things are agreed by consensus in the Security Council, and business gets done. But of course, those aren't the things that get the headlines.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned the sustaining peace resolution. Ambassador Vinit, I remember Poland was quite strongly promoting the subjects of conflict prevention and the whole sustaining peace resolution during the campaign for the Security Council seat. How do you see that concept going forward and developing? What are the main sort of obstacles to go through to actually move towards the implementation?
Well, I will agree that in the last 12 months there was visible improvement. Secretary Guterres he's trying to be very efficient and effective leader. He just announced his Action for Peacekeeping initiative, which we supported, which is much more comprehensive approach to the problem. This is not only peacekeeping, this is also preventing diplomacy, combine peacekeeping with issues related to sustainable growth and human rights, but also problems like security sector reforms in the countries where peacekeepers do operate. And we know from experience that this can be an important problem in some areas. Good governance, again, it's impossible to have effective and efficient peacekeeping operation when there's completely no good governance on the territory. So this is much more comprehensive approach, and this is exactly what we were looking. Poland probably will return very soon to peacekeeping operation. We proposed 300 troops to the new Golan Heights operation, which probably will start next year. But there are actually two problems. One is more strategic and one kind of a tactical or internal. Strategic is the definition of mandate for each and every mission and rule of engagement. Because people sometimes forget that we are talking about peacekeeping and not peace enforcing operations. And this is a big difference. So when peacekeepers are deployed in not too friendly environment with very limited mandate, this is invitation for problems. And unfortunately, for example, situation in northern Mali can be interpreted this way. When the mandate do not fit well to the conditions on the ground. Well, of course, the mandate must be agreed by Security Council. So to reach the consensus, sometimes we need compromises. And this compromise can then, you know, be very tragic for peacekeepers when someone is killed. But there's another problem which is more internal. This is that some of the troop providers do not have capabilities, or sometimes they do declare they do, but in fact they don't have it. So this creates problem, maybe not in the first day, but the second week, UN realized that something is wrong. And this is why Guterres wants to change the whole system of accreditation. So if country A declares that some capabilities, they have these capabilities, it means they have the capabilities. So this is important factor and something which can be done internally through the reform of the UN system. And we very much hope that this will go in this direction, and we will avoid extremely difficult or brutal problems we had in the past with the performance of peacekeepers, which is another very sad subject, and zero tolerance policy is one of the must for the UN.
It's interesting you mentioned you know, the Golan Heights mission here. I wanted to ask Almut, you know, many times when there's no solution to the problem, the solution is to throw the UN in. And I think you know, there might be a possibility that in the near time we're going to see missions erupting. Syria, perhaps, maybe Yemen, maybe other places. How do you see, if we were to speculate a little bit, how do you see those opportunities or you know, this kind of situations arising? Will we see more peace operations in those conflicts and crises we're looking at today?
Well, if you asked anybody at the UN, especially the Department for Peacekeeping Operations, and mentioned the possibility that there should be a peace operation functioning in Yemen or Syria, they would answer you, this is the biggest threat ever to us, because the situation is so complicated that we wouldn't know where to start. But let me say something else. I mean, it's really good news that you're going to send troops to the Golan Heights. And I think it's in this spirit that if various countries contribute, that there will be kind of a common approach and comprehensive approach. The comprehensive is really the military, the police, the civilians, and being in Warsaw, in the center of Europe, I'd also like to say it would be great to have a partner here working with civilians, because there's so much expertise, there's so much professional expertise. So maybe that is also an option to, I mean, since we're always looking for ways to cooperate and define common interest, and I think that will be definitely a common interest of us. It would be a good way to kind of start a new cooperation. In terms of the future of UN peace operations, I really think the future are regional organizations. I think really it is, 80% of UN peace operations are right now on the African continent. And I think the way we all have to go is to strengthen the African Union. Actually, they are leading the biggest peace operation in this world, which is in Somalia. It's AMISOM, it's African troops, it's not UN troops. And we're also cooperating with building the civilian capabilities. There is a lot of police that is being trained in order to work in peace operations. So talking about Syria and Yemen, I think there is a possibility that a regional organization like the African Union, like the League of Arab States, might take the leading role and then tell other organizations, whether it is the European Union in the framework of its common foreign and security policy, or others, the bits and pieces that they don't have, because that's what's happening nowadays times. In many countries, there is more than one peace operations. In Mali, there are nearly 10. We always call it the 10 shades of khaki, which is maybe not a nice description, but this is the way it will work in the future. There will be modular peace operations, and you will find out that there are some UN operations, for especially the special political missions, which are strong on mediation and political instruments, but you might find some technical tool for the European Union, like the rule of law, and you would find out that the majority of troops probably will be African.
Thanks very much for this, Corinne. If you could pick up on also on this subject, and one thing that has been controversial but discussed quite a lot in our region has been the prospect for a peacekeeping operation or peace operation in Ukraine and in Donbass. And is this something that you could see somehow coming into life in any shape or form, or would there not be any consensus feasible in the near future in the Security Council?
Well, I think we can be honest and say that it's unlikely there would be a consensus on a peace operation in Ukraine anytime soon. But I think it's useful to have that possibility on the table because it gets people thinking about the kind of shape of peace that might be there to keep in the future. But the short answer to that question, I think, is no.
Right. It's no, the prospect of an opportunity. I think that's something that is one of the useful areas that the Security Council still provides. Even if there's an impasse, then the opportunity could arise. But the thinking of some of the global conflicts, crises that are on the agenda. I wanted to ask Julianne about Afghanistan because we've recently seen an effort to basically make a deal with the Taliban. Zalmay Khalilzad, who actually was supposed to come to our conference, was just nominated as the special envoy. How is this seen from Washington? How would that potential agreement look like?
Well, I can't say specifically what the deal would look like. The reaction to it has been mixed. I mean, on the one hand, increasingly there are people in the national security community wandering around Washington, and they can be from both political parties, really asking the question after 17 plus years, what is it exactly we're doing in Afghanistan? Why? Many Americans, I think, lack an appreciation that we still have a significant presence there. There's confusion about what the actual mission is. There have been various narratives put out by multiple administrations. And so on the one hand, there seems to be some eagerness to bring this to a close and end this mission that seems like it's just going to carry on until the end of time. And on the other hand, there are certainly skeptics about, and there have always been skeptics, about the risks and challenges and opportunities of negotiating with the Taliban. But I think what was once a highly controversial suggestion and policy proposal is starting to move towards some wider acceptance because, again, of this appreciation that there's really a significant degree of uncertainty about what this mission represents. And it was Barack Obama who felt like he was elected in 2008 to get the United States out of Afghanistan. And alas, that didn't come to pass. And Trump, too, made a lot of promises on the campaign trail about removing the United States from Afghanistan, and in fact has had a modest surge, and also seems to be at a bit of a loss. The sadder story is just inside the government and outside of the government, Afghanistan is not the beating heart of what we're doing right now in the world. And the number of people that have some deep appreciation and understanding of the entire conflict, but also can currently describe what U.S. policy is and what we're doing there, it's a very small group of people. But again, I think now that American public opinion has changed so significantly, maybe we'll eventually see broad support for negotiating with the Taliban.
Thank you for that. Speaking of negotiation, and before I turn to the floor, Prime Minister, what role do you foresee? What role should the European Union play, particularly in crisis conflicts in its broad neighborhood, which have had such a huge, tremendous impact on the security of the community and more broader on the politics of the community? So should there be a stronger investment in EU capacities to engage as mediators, as supporters of peace operations? How do you see this development going?
Well, I think we're seeing, and have been seeing now for some years, an evolution of the European Common Foreign and Security Policy. And if you look at it globally, European Union, when you included the institutions and all of the 28 member states together, are by some distance the biggest contributors now to development aid in the world, biggest contributors to humanitarian aid. When you take into account the size of the European largest market in the world, massive opportunity for its trade and for the integration of all of that into a comprehensive approach. We've seen, I think, particularly in recent years, I think particularly under Federica Mogherini's time as High Representative, both the outline of the global strategy for the European Union, setting out what the policy is, but over the course of the last year to 2 years, the development also of the defence and security side of the European Union, giving rise to opportunities to contribute to peacekeeping, to peace missions. I think there are 17 EU peace missions in different parts of the world right now, some of them in Europe's own neighbourhood. So that's growing. There's also the new arm of the European Union dealing with mediation and prevention. So I think you're going to see over the coming period a much more active role by the European Union. And I think as the global picture is also changing, I think there is an increasing sense within the European Union and within the External Action Service of the need for the EU to step up to the plate and to support the multilateralist approach, to be multilateralist when perhaps others are pulling back from it, to be a supporter of the United Nations and its organizations. So I think you're going to see a more active EU role. And I think that's also reflected when one looks at the MFF, the 7-year budget of the EU, which is currently under negotiation. There's actually a very significant proposed increase in the budgetary capacity of the EU to carry out that type of work.
Oh, and which is clearly an important part. I have more follow-up questions, but I will let anybody from the audience who wants to ask a question to our panelists do that. I see a hand. Please, if you can pass the mic, and another one. Please introduce yourself.
Constante Geberti, CFR. Madam Wieland, you made a very convincing case for conflict prevention. Could you give us examples of successful conflict prevention that you'd like the international community to emulate? For instance, was Libya 2011 a case of successful prevention? And I was struck by the fact that the term R2P hasn't even appeared in the discussion. Does anything remain of R2P, Ambassador Vinit?
Thank you very much. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and
Hi, I'm Julien Terrand from Sciences Po. I studied several years ago the number of conflicts, of every kind of conflicts in the European neighborhood. And I did it again with the same factors a couple of years ago. And I just saw that the number of conflicts actually completely increased in the European neighborhood. So I know that the European Union developed massive tools for stabilization and peacekeeping operations. But I wonder, how is it ontologically quite impossible for the EU to stabilize its neighborhood?
Thank you. Any other hands were up? One more, yeah.
Hello, I have a question for Mr. Gilmore. I'm a U.S. university student and I focus on Latin American policy. First of all, I want to thank you so much for what you've done in the Colombian peace process. I was so joyed of what happened a few years ago. But in recent events and recent news in the past couple months, it appears that former FARC members are returning to their arms and they're discontent with how things are going on and they don't feel respected. And so specifically in regards to the political participation of former FARC members in trying to get them to run for office and become part of the political framework, how best could we encourage, both as the Colombian government and then as the international community, to get these former FARC members in the political framework? And how do you see this as a comparative case to the Good Friday Agreement?
So we have conflict prevention examples, R2P, which is responsibility to protect principles, to clarify, and Minister Gilmore, a direct question on Colombia to you.
Well, first of all, you are correct that some former FARC combatants have gone back to illegality, to criminality. I think that was to be expected. I think in all peace processes of this kind, and you drew comparison with Northern Ireland, which I also had experience of, there are always going to be some dissidents. There will be some, and in the case of Colombia, what is driving that in particular is the drugs trade. There's a big illegal economy, and there's big temptation for people to stay with that business and to stay engaged with it, and that has happened in the case of some FARC combatants. What we have to do, and the work that's underway at the moment, and which the European Union is supporting, is a process of reincorporation and a process of productive work to reintegrate and to reincorporate former FARC combatants into Colombian society and into productive activity. And in fact, the new government, as I mentioned earlier, the new president, who had originally been an opponent of the agreement, has very much given his commitment to supporting that work. And he and I visited one of the FARC areas where this reintegration and reincorporation work is going about 2 weeks ago. So there is work taking place on that. The other factor, of course, in Colombia, which I think we have to keep a very close eye on, is Venezuela, and the influence of Venezuela on the situation there, and that's probably a topic for much longer than you have left in this session.
Thank you very much. Conflict prevention?
It's a very good question. Actually, there's probably no panel where I don't get that question, so I do owe you an answer. I think my answer is, first of all, to understand why do people fight? Why there is war? Well, there is war because there's inequality in this world, there's war because there's exclusion, there's war because there's injustice, and there's war because there's a whole industry profiting from war. So if you have this, you understand why war happens. So then, of course, the question is, how do you prevent war or conflict from happening? Of course, if you reduce these four elements I mentioned earlier, of course, the probability of war or conflict is lower. So whatever we do, for example, in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals until 2030, for example, to improve gender equality, to alleviate poverty, to build sustainable institutions, all of this is actually the true character of conflict prevention. And this is the more abstract world, but of course that is what it really will eventually, hopefully, reduce conflicts in this world if the whole political setting is right to that. And the second element is good offices. The good offices is provided, it's not in the news, it's not on the headlines. It happens, for example, in the context of the neighbors to the River Nile. There's a lot of potential conflict because it's a question who takes how much of water out of this river. There are 4 neighbors to this river, and there are many mediators who are really talking and trying to find out a contract. So there is a transparency that who can take how much out of the water. So in order for Egypt, who are the last in the line, that there is still enough water for Egypt to survive. And of course, the whole issue about the treaties, about the water treaties of the River Nile are really a good example for conflict prevention, because if this is not being solved, this issue, there will be war in the region, because of resources, just to give you one concrete example.
Thank you very much. Ambassador?
Thank you very much. If I can start or come back for a moment to EU cooperation within the UN, because I believe it's a very good example that actually EU is doing very good job coordinating most of the things in the UN framework. First of all, now we have very unique situation when there are 5 EU countries in the Security Council, 5 out of 15. And this is very unique because, ladies and gentlemen, 4 years from now, we can have only one. This is France. I assuming, this is maybe, I'm sorry to say that, but I'm assuming that Ireland will lose the elections.
I wouldn't assume that at all, Ambassador.
Well, Poland right now is member of the Security Council. Germany was just elected. Ireland has very difficult campaign versus Norway and Canada, which are not EU, and we will lose our British friends, unfortunately, from the picture. So this is Security Council, but also important coordination deals with different resolutions in the General Assembly. And of all the subjects during my tenure, we were able to agree on all resolutions concerning Ukraine, for example. There were 3 areas where we did not have the consensus. One was Egypt, the second was Western Sahara, and the third one was Iran, basically. So when we look at all the issues, this is not bad score, I would say. I mean, and some of the differences, of course, were resolved in the very last moment. This is, kind of a hobby of the diplomats to reach agreement during the night, before the vote or before the important speech. But this is part of the game. So this EU cooperation and coordination in the UN system works well, and we should keep this, especially assuming that there will be fewer members of the EU in the Security Council in the future. And EU is, in the UN system, EU countries are in the 3 regional groups. Not 1, not 2, 3. Western Europe is Western Europe, Poland is Eastern European group, and Cyprus is in Asia, according to the UN. So coordination is a little bit difficult, but I think we are doing quite well. Responsibility to protect, well, this is extremely important subject. We could, use another session to discuss it. So, I don't want to go into details. I mean, we would love to live in ideal world and that countries will respect the rights of its citizens. But the abilities of the UN to intervene is not that visible, to put it diplomatically. So maybe next year we can organize a session on this subject, and maybe then we will have more positive notes.
Thank you for that. If I may take your point, it would be interesting actually to hear from Corinne. following Brexit, can we maintain actually the same level of cooperation and engagement that we've had before, or will things change in the Security Council and with EU countries?
Well, I knew we wouldn't be able to have a session without mentioning Brexit.
Sorry.
I think what's interesting for me as someone in our foreign ministry whose career has revolved around the UN and thinking in a Security Council context is that actually it would make, we expect it would make less difference than people imagine, because when we're operating in the Security Council, we're working with various allies who are not necessarily EU member states. So the EU member states don't coordinate as the EU within the Security Council. And of course, it's no secret that the P3 work together closely, that we work with our P5 colleagues, that we work in variable geometries depending on who the members of the Security Council are in any given year. So on the face of it, it will make less difference in the Security Council than it might actually make in other parts of the UN system, where we work much more closely and negotiate as the EU and as an EU member state and in EU burden sharing teams. But I just wanted to also come back to the point about conflict prevention. I think the interesting point to note there is the difference between conflict prevention and conflict resolution, and the point that where conflicts are prevented, they tend to sort of pass somewhat unnoticed. Although you could probably draw a very big example. If we'd been having this conversation this time a year ago, we might have thought we were on the brink of World War III in a nuclear war between DPRK and the US. That didn't happen. Is that an example of conflict prevention? I'm not sure. But, you know, there are examples of things that didn't happen, and because they didn't happen, they're easily forgotten. But I would give one practical example that I think we could draw on that also relates to this idea that it's not all about the UN, it's also about regional organizations. If we look at the example of the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and their intervention in the Gambia, you know, that was potentially a conflict that was about to happen, and that intervention prevented that conflict from happening. So there are good examples, but I think they get quickly forgotten because they disappear out of the headlines. And then just on R2P, I think we have to be honest that the concept of R2P emerged at a particularly positive and optimistic time, I would argue, in the UN in the mid-noughties, and that it's got harder since then. And I think we have to be honest also that it has since then always been a contentious concept. So whilst we support it and we advocate for it, it's frankly never going to have universal acceptance. But I think that's only part of a wider picture that includes international humanitarian law and humanitarian intervention, where we definitely do take action where action needs to be taken.
Thank you very much. I have I need to pick up on this since you mentioned the conflict prevention deal in Korea. Well, Julian, if you could tell us what's the deal with the deal? Is it where's this?
We need another panel.
Yes, I'm aware.
But the quick answer, the deal with the deal is we don't know. There's been a lot said about the deal and how the threat of war is now drifting away and the world is a safer place. But as we've all seen from the follow-up negotiations and the visits that Pompeo has made in consultations, meeting his counterparts from North Korea, I mean, there's not a lot to show. So we're all breathing a sigh of relief, thankful that we're not in the place that you just mentioned, where many of us did think that we were on the brink of war. But I think, for me personally, I'm not reassured yet that this story is over. And I think they rushed, the members of the administration, to a conclusion that was not supported by the facts. So we've had a lot of fanfare and celebration, but I think the devil's in the details.
Well, thanks very much for that. Any last comment from the panelists? Prime Minister, we started optimistically, maybe an optimistic message.
Well, I'd like to thank the ambassador for giving me the opportunity. I hadn't expected to get it. of plugging Ireland's candidacy for the Security Council in 2020 and ensuring that the level of EU representation on the Security Council is maintained at an adequate level. Thank you, Ambassador, for that opportunity.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please a great round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Thank you all very, very much for the discussion.